Ever wondered how to turn yourself into an incredible test taker and clinician? I'm Dr. Alec Palmerton, and in this unique episode, Dr. Leah Tron, one of my Harvard MGH mentors, interviews me on how anyone can transform their approach to learning. We'll explore how to make success inevitable, discuss how to turn failures into opportunities, and reveal the mindset shifts that help students go from the bottom 3% to the top 3% on the USMLEs and other exams. Let's dive in.
I got to know you when we were working together, taking care of some very sick patients in the inpatient setting, giving them anesthesia. I particularly remember some on-call nights where we had some emergencies come through and you were leading the team. And now your career has gone in a new direction, and I'd love to learn about how you started, how you got to where you are.
Well, that's a great question. I think that for me, it started, I've always loved teaching. My mom was a college professor, and I have always thought, I'd always thought I would go into education in some form. I think one of the challenges that I saw in medicine was that to be a teacher was sort of to voluntarily take on a more difficult path in many levels, right? I think that when I arrived at Stanford for medical school, I think the first thing that I realized was that lectures, for some reason, just weren't very good, for lack of a good way of saying it. And I think initially I didn't really know why until I started to look at the incentives and realized that teachers weren't paid, they weren't promoted, they weren't selected or anything based on their teaching. And in fact, they were being paid and promoted based off of their research and their clinical practice. And so that got all of their attention. And so sort of like in high school, you have some assignments that count for your grade and some assignments that don't. It makes complete sense that you would not work towards the assignments that don't count for your grade. And so I couldn't blame the teachers, right? They were acting like rational human beings. They were putting all of their energy towards the things that would give them both career advancement as well as monetary remuneration. And so, but the lectures ended up being a bunch of memorization and just things that they would take some sort of lecture from, say, another research talk that they'd given. And then they would talk about their research. And I remember thinking why are they talking about their research? Until I realized again, that this is their incentive. They're incentivized to do these things. And so I wanted to transform education. I'd always wanted to do something that could help with changing, because I didn't really think that I could change the system from the inside, because the system itself was the thing that was incentivizing the wrong behaviors. So I wanted to figure out exactly what it took to help take someone who was struggling with learning and to turn them into someone that was a successful, practicing physician.
That's a big vision.
Yeah.
It's a huge vision.
Yeah.
How'd you start working on that?
I don't think it really started necessarily as that vision. I think it was more just I could see the problem in front of me, and I was there's got to be a way. I think everyone that goes through medical school realizes there are so many ways that this could be better on so many different levels. And so it started as just, I was a tutor. So when I was at Stanford, they had a tutor program where older students would tutor younger students, and so I participated in that. I was a TA. And one of the things that we did was, I was a biochem TA. And I loved biochemistry. I was a chemistry major in college, and there was, the problem was that Stanford, up until that point, had never had a biochemistry class. They'd had it decades ago, but then they'd stopped and they brought it back. And so it was the first year that they had it. And it was the worst, lowest rated class of any course, which was interesting because the professors actually really cared. They really cared. They were brilliant. 2 of the 3 course directors were MacArthur Genius Fellows. It was but it was interesting because the students just hated it, just absolutely hated it. But the way that I studied for it was there were these interesting kind of side stories that the professor would say during the lessons. He would say, oh, and that's why when you drink alcohol, you can get really hypoglycemic because it inhibits gluconeogenesis. And he would just say this as this throwaway thing. But I was riveted by those. I was wait, what? Like, there's a biological basis for like why it makes sense that when you drink alcohol, if you follow the pathway and you look at the metabolism of alcohol and NADH, and like you can actually see exactly why you become hypoglycemic when you are fasting and you drink alcohol. Because what I wanted to do sort of from the beginning was I didn't want to just learn the information, I wanted to learn it so I could use it. I wanted to remember it. I wanted to use it so that I could help patients. And so I would like furiously like scribble down my notes as I was watching those lectures. And so when I was selected as a biochem TA the next year, I actually just made lectures based around those stories.
Oh, what a fun idea. I want to take that class.
And so I would start with these ideas and I would say, okay, like, do you know why for someone that is like, you know, drinking alcohol and is fasting, why they get hypoglycemic or what their blood glucose levels would be, and can you explain it biochemically? And so we would start with that problem, and then I would teach them all of the information necessary from the biochemical pathways so that they could understand it. And then at the end, I would just say like, okay, now figure it out. Like, you have all of the information necessary to figure this out. Now, like, talk about it with your partner, and like you'll figure it out. And so instead of it being like the way that they had they had taught it initially, where it was, okay, I'm just going to sit here and kind of go through the pathways and explain like, this is the Krebs cycle, and this is citrate, and then this enzyme turns it into, right? We made it practical, and we made it clinically relevant. And so those were very, very well, accepted and very popular. So I ended up being, you know, outstanding TA of the year, and they took the lessons were so popular, and because it was so the class was so unpopular, they ended up taking those lessons and basing flipping the course. So that was actually what the lectures became, and then they took the previous lessons and made them just like video recordings, so that you just would watch them.
Accessible. Well, all I can say is kudos to you, but and also kudos to your professors for their humility and openness to having their. They sound like a really neat group.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, it would not have happened without their leadership and to recognize like, hey, like, yeah, like this is something that is, you know, working well. Like, why not just base our lectures around that? So
how'd you take me forward from there? How'd you get from there to where you are now?
So I think that, like, maybe to step back a little bit, okay. I was never very good at standardized tests when I was growing up. I actually didn't even know that you were supposed to study for them. My dream was to go to Princeton when I was in high school. And no one from my high school had ever gone. And I got rejected because I did not have, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons, but one of the most obvious ones was my SAT scores were not very high. And it was really painful for me. And I realized like I could have the best grades, I could know the material, but if I didn't have good test scores, like it wouldn't really, like there was going to be a cap into what it is that I would be able to accomplish. And so I made it sort of my mission to figure out like, okay, I never want this to be the thing that holds me back again. Like I've got to be able to figure this out. Other people are able to do this. And so I just try to figure out like, what does it take to do well on standardized exams? So I studied for the MCAT, and I slowly but surely increased my score and scored in, at the time it was the 99th percentile. And realized like, oh, okay, like these are things that can be taught. These are things like, there's things that people that score well in these exams that they're doing differently. And if I can learn them, then I must be able to teach someone else how to do this. And so part of what I did then was to figure out, okay, like first I need to be able to prove that I can do it myself. And so I studied for Step 1, which at the time was obviously the most important exam, and scored very high on that. So I scored 270, which was at the time like, top like 0.1% on the exam. And I was like, oh, okay, like I'm doing things that are different. Like these are things that I'm not a genius. Like I wasn't naturally good. I hadn't done very well on a lot of the standardized exams when I was younger, but these are things that I like learned myself and then I can teach someone else. And so I was recruited by a tutoring company at the time because I'd scored so well, and they, just basically connected me with students to teach. And I realized like, oh, like these things work. Like if I teach someone how to study differently, they can really, like, you can make a really dramatic difference in someone's confidence and outcomes and everything.
So what I'm hearing is that you're teaching not just what to learn, but also how to go about learning it. Are you able to, do you mind sharing some?
Sure.
Like, what are the hard parts for people learning? What are the common obstacles?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that, like, fundamentally, to do well on, obviously we teach people how to do well on tests, so I think about it kind of from that standpoint, but I think that you can use this framework for really anything, any sort of applied learning problem. Fundamentally, to do well on any of these applied learning problems, you need three things. A, you have to learn it well, meaning like you have to understand the concept behind it. You have to not just memorize the information. B, you have to have a system for remembering it, right? Medicine, I think that's more true than any other subject because there's just so much knowledge that you need. It's not like physics where it's like most of physics can be boiled down to the first law of thermodynamics. You really have to have a wide body of knowledge. And then the third is you have to learn how to actually transfer that knowledge and use it in context and apply it. If you can do those three things, you can do remarkable, remarkable feats. Learn it well, never forget it, and learn how to apply it. Because ultimately, there's no, if you never forget something that you learn, there's no cap to the amount of knowledge that you can have. If you've learned it well in the first place, there is just so much knowledge that you can bring to bear on the topic. And if you have the skills of being able to actually apply it in either clinical practice or on, in our case, like an exam, it just makes a huge, huge difference.
I want to work on this. This is very appealing sounding. The never forget it part, can you tell me a little more about how you do that? How do you teach people to retain?
Sure. So a lot of people are familiar with, it's called spaced repetition. And so spaced repetition is a system that was developed in the early 1900s empirically by, I think his name was like Carl Ebbinghaus. But basically he empirically tested himself to see how long it took him to forget certain things. Like I think he would memorize 7 sort of nonsense syllables and see how long it took him to forget it. And what he found is that if you reviewed it within a certain time frame, he wouldn't forget it. And that the more times he reviewed it without forgetting it, the longer that time frame would be. And so that became the basis of the spaced repetition algorithm. Now, for 100 years, decades, that was a good theory, and it sort of became the basis of interleaved practice, which was used, however, once people figured out that they could make a computer program that would take that algorithm and systematize it, that allowed it to really take off. And so when I was at Stanford, this was just sort of starting to become more popular in medicine, this idea of, okay, once you learn something, you can never forget it, and using the spaced repetition algorithm. So I learned how to use the program Anki, which is free, widely available, and just started making flashcards with the on the things that I was learning. And what I realized is that it really is true, right? Like what you are putting into your cards, as long as you do your cards every day, because of the way that the algorithm is set up, you really can never forget those things.
It's extraordinarily potent, and I'm thinking how I need to get this into my life. Wow, thank you. That's really good to hear about. I'm curious, when you make your cards, are there ways to do this better? There must be. I bet you've learned about this.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face when talking to students about Anki is that the way that most people use it, I think, is very ineffective. So the way that most people use Anki, they're using it as a way to try to memorize things better. Yeah,
that's what it sounds like it should be.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
So like flashcards. I mean, it's like most of us, when we think of flashcards, we think of like a really simple question on the front,
and a one-word
thing on the back, right? Like vocabulary flashcards for language come to mind, right? Which is, I think, initially how Anki was, was created. The better way, so you can do that, and it works very well for that. But again, if you're trying to solve the problem of learning things well and applying it, right, it doesn't work very well. And so if you're trying to figure out how can I interpret labs, or how can I look at an x-ray and know what's going on, or be able to put together this patient's chest pain with the fact that they're bradycardic.
Like very complex problems.
Right, like those are things that you can't really do effectively with a flashcard in the traditional sense. However, when you combine it with the ability to connect things together, you can do wonderful things. So we'll take the example of the hypoglycemia with an alcoholic patient before, right? So I would make flashcards where I would ask myself, in a patient that is, drinking alcohol and they're fasting, would their sugar be, abnormally high or low? Why would that make sense? And walk through the pathway.
So that makes, though, doing your Anki cards a much more of a mental exercise. It's not a quick, easy, you have to think.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So what I realized is that, I could train myself in the same way just by using the space repetition algorithm, right, in a more systematic way to remember the things that I wanted to remember and use.
But I would think there'd be an obstacle for all of us who are innately looking for the easy path. There'd be an obstacle to doing the harder cards, because it's like, oh wow, I've got to walk through that whole pathway. Like, whoa. How do you help people get over that hump?
That's fair. I think there's a couple ways that you can do it. One is to recognize that even though cards that you memorize are innately, I think, easier, or they're certainly faster to do, they're less enjoyable.
Okay.
And so one of the things that we hear a lot from people when they're doing those sort of memorization type cards is that, like, I don't know anyone that enjoys it. Right? Even the ones that will do it, it's kind of this miserable experience. And in fairness, right, like doing flashcards itself, I think like studying itself can be hard. Like you have to do it, whether you want to do it or not. Like it is challenging. However, I think what makes it more challenging for a lot of people is if the cards themselves are just tedium.
Yeah, where's the joy?
Yeah. It's horrible, right? And so you're spending hours a day doing like hundreds, if not sometimes for some of these people, they're doing like thousands of cards because they're trying to memorize everything in medicine as if it's a fact, as opposed to seeing the concept behind it.
Yeah, you actually probably have way fewer cards if you do the concept.
Exactly. Like I think I've made like about 20,000 cards total since 2000, for the last 15 years. Whereas for just step one, the memorization type decks have like maybe, 3 times, it's like 40, 50,000 cards. Wow. Because everything is memorized as a fact. Right?
It's also less, when you were talking about the ability to apply it as a third case, you need to be able to build it and extrapolate, which you probably can't do with just a straight memorization.
Yes, exactly.
So you're talking about bringing some joy into it, and that makes me think about a lot of challenging practices, like learning how to practice meditation. And they often say during that, like, try to find one element that you enjoy in this. Like, what is one nice? Would keep going through the challenge of bringing your brain back, which is hard work, and try to find some enjoyment in this. And it sounds like you're looking for a way to find enjoyment in a hard thing there. Do you teach your students to look for joy in it? Like, how do you get them to do that, or do you just demonstrate it, or like how do you communicate that?
That's a great question. So I think that it's really getting, I think, to the question of intrinsic motivation, right? So intrinsic motivation, I think a lot of studies have suggested that intrinsic motivation meaning not extrinsic. So extrinsic motivation is like, I'm doing something because I get some sort of external reward, right? And we live in that world, like I totally understand that. But what we also try to do is to help people develop intrinsic motivation, where the activity itself is the reward. Right, I study not necessarily just because I want to get a good score, right? Like obviously that is one of the goals, but I'm studying because I enjoy learning. Yeah. Right, because if the journey itself is more enjoyable,
you're going to take that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Right, like you're going to want to study a lot more. Yeah. And studies have shown that obviously the people that are intrinsically motivated, where the work itself is rewarding, as well as obviously the external reward, you will do much better.
Well, and that's what we seek in our careers as well.
Yes.
Maybe be intrinsic. Maybe we find the intrinsic rewards. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for intrinsic
how do you?
Motivation,
yeah, teach me. Yeah.
So there's three components. One is autonomy / choice, right? The second is meaning or purpose, and then the third is competence. And so obviously, one of the things that we have people do is we have them think why am I really doing this? I think
do you ask them? Do you walk them through this?
We do. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things there was an inspiring story about the Marines, right? So the Marines are extrinsically probably one of the least extrinsically rewarding jobs you can imagine, right? It's dangerous.
Yep.
It's in many ways thankless.
Yep.
You don't get paid a lot. You have to wake up really early, do a lot of, grunt, like unpleasant physical labor. Like it really is very, very not extrinsically rewarding. However, it has one of the highest job satisfactions of any job, meaning that it is driven hugely by intrinsic motivation. People are doing it because the job itself. I mean, if you talk to people, like, they will proudly say that they were in the Marines decades later.
Yes.
And so the question is what are they doing differently where they can turn something that is extrinsically very, very challenging and on the surface not particularly rewarding into something that people will literally risk their life for. And so one of the things that they do is they will tie the difficult thing that they're doing to a deeper purpose. And so, for example, if someone is going on, if they're about to, like, say, like, make their bed or do something where it's like they're about to do like a difficult run, they'll say, why are you doing this? And the answer isn't like, oh, well, I'm doing this because I need to make my bed, right? Because my drill sergeant told me to, right? The answer is, I'm doing this because I want to provide for my family in a way that I didn't have growing up, right? They're tying it back to something that is deeply meaningful and purposeful for them. And so that's one of the things that we talk about in the program is like, okay, like it is hard. You're going to do things that you're not going to want to do in life, in medicine, and when you're studying. However, if you can remember and explicitly tie that uncomfortable, undesirable thing to a deeper purpose that you have, you will find that thing much more tolerable and even more intrinsically rewarding, where the activity will become itself the reward. Another thing that we do is, I would say that the biggest thing that makes the biggest difference is when people can actually see results, right? So competence, right? So this is sort of like the tiger parenting model of like, get your kid to work really, really hard at something that's not, maybe intrinsically or even necessarily extrinsically rewarding in the beginning that naturally people aren't going to want to do, like practicing violin or, practicing their, scales or whatever. However, when you get good at it, it becomes fun, right?
And you see you've done this.
And you see that you've done it.
Yeah.
You can see the improvement. And so that's the other thing that we do is that we try to collapse the scale of what it is that people are doing to something that's small and manageable, right? I think a lot of mistakes that I see come from people trying to do too much too soon. If they, it's like, it makes sense. Like when I was studying for, say step 1, I tried to study from all subjects because I already knew a lot. So it made sense for me to study from all subjects. However, for a lot of people, if they're feeling really overwhelmed with the amount of material, they probably shouldn't be doing like mixed questions in a question bank block, right? Instead, just focus on a small thing. And so you can stack up some wins. And so what you can do is if you can show someone, hey, like, if I just learn, say, like coronary artery disease, if I just learn that really, really well, I will A, feel different when I'm doing the question, and B, I will start to see myself getting more of those questions correct for the right reasons. And so there's usually after you get through maybe like 1 or 2 organ systems, there's this sort of light bulb that sometimes very quickly or sometimes gradually will sort of flip for people.
Do you think that light bulb is that they see their competence or that they have insight into the process and develop belief in, where do you think that comes from?
I think that's a great question. I would imagine probably both.
Yeah.
Right? It's like there's something different when I see myself do something hard that I thought that I wasn't capable of doing. And now I've sort of demystified it. Yep. So on one hand, it's like, oh, okay, like now I get it.
Yeah.
Like I see how the sausage is made. And then B, I can do it. Like I can do every single step of it. And because you have the ability to, once you've learned something, you never forget it. Now you're like, oh, if I just keep doing this, I can
apply it. The sky is the limit.
Like
the trajectories.
There is no, exactly. There's no limit to what it is that I can do. And that is really exciting for people.
Well, it's really exciting to me to hear about it because you're giving this gift for whatever exam they're working for to teach them that they have this ability, that they have it within themselves to do this, but you're really teaching them this life skill for how to tackle hard things that are out of their wheelhouse now, but are going to become their, like, what an incredible, what an incredible ability to give them insight into a process that makes life better.
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the things that I don't think I realized when I started was just how much, and this is true of myself too, like just how much of the things that have held me back were inside of me.
Yeah.
You know, just like
but
dealing with hard
you didn't
things.
have Dr. Alec Palmerton breaking it down for you and making it bite-sized and helping you find the intrinsic motivation and develop it. And you didn't have that. You did.
I had excellent mentors, in fairness. I did have some excellent role models. And I think it was also just, a lot of it is just like reading, you know, figuring these things out. And just the thing that I've tried to do for the last, 10-ish years, but particularly over the last 5 or 6, since I've done this full time, is I've really, really tried to figure out every single possible thing that could hold someone back from being successful.
Fascinating thing to learn about.
It's sort of like the research process, right? Like if my hypothesis is and was that if I could help the people that were struggling the most, people that were, because it's like obviously anyone or many people can take someone that was already probably going to be successful and teach them a little bit of things, claim credit, and say like, oh, like yes, like I was the reason that they were successful, right? Like we've all, MGH is full of examples of this, right? I think, however, in my case, maybe because I'm a glutton for pain, but I felt that if I really wanted to make a difference, I needed to figure out every single possible thing that could hold someone back. And take the people that were struggling the most.
Yep.
Because if I could take the person that was struggling the most and help them be successful, help them get high scores, then I could take really anyone along that entire sort of like path. Like I had a friend once who said, if you want to learn something well, don't learn from someone who's naturally good.
No.
Learn from someone who was horrible in the beginning and then became good.
Because they will know what they had to do.
Yes, exactly. And so I had kind of gone through that process myself to an extent, right? I wasn't particularly good at standardized exams to begin with. And then I also needed to figure out, okay, like which of those things that I was doing was most important at which time.
You know what you're describing though, what I'm hearing is you have that enjoyment in the journey. You're truly finding the joy in the discovery of how to help others, decoding this process. Yeah. Can you give some examples of things that you found where you see people getting in their own way?
Oh yeah, for sure. I would say that, one example I think is expectations. So, and this is true of myself. So I think one thing is these are all things that I've struggled with, and so it's easier for me to sort of see in other people. But for example, if someone does like try something and their score doesn't go up, right? There are 2 ways of looking at that. You can either think, oh, okay, well, there must be something wrong with me or what it is that I was doing, right? This just isn't going to work. Or you can look at that and say, oh, okay, I just haven't figured it out yet. Like there's something wrong about what it is that I'm doing, and I just have to figure out what it is and just do it. This is expected, right? I mean, it kind of gets to like the growth mindset versus like fixed mindset, right? If I have a fixed mindset, I'm more likely to think, if I think like, okay, I'm either good at this or I'm bad at this, right? I will use external things as either proof that I am good enough or that I'm not good enough, right? Or that and so I think that's something that I myself have struggled with. And I see that a lot. I think in part because I struggle with it is where people will do something and they'll think, oh gosh, like, I tried this thing and like my score didn't go up. This must not be right, or, oh, like.
But like a lot of people have lived and thought that way for a long time by the time they come into contact with you. Yeah. They've practiced those neural pathways. How do you help them to try growth mindset? How do you get people to try?
That's a great question. I mean, they say that profound personal change happens from either desperation or inspiration.
Okay.
And so, I mean, just
Yeah.
a lot of people that we work with, just by the nature of the kind of work that we do, they happen to be in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And
they probably failed.
They've
They probably hit a bottom before they've come to you.
They failed. They have, they've hit like a plateau that is well below where it is they want to be. Maybe they're 10% below passing. Maybe they're 10 points away from getting a 260. Whatever it is, they're at like the limit of what it is that they think that they can accomplish. And so, honestly, part of it is just that there are times in people's lives, I can't remember who said, like, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. We have an opportunity, I think, because I've done a lot of different teaching in a lot of different contexts. I've taught, early medical students at Stanford. I've taught, high school students and college students. The thing that I think is unique about the work that we're able to do, that I've sort of learned through perspective, is that there's something special about when people are in a very sort of painful place. They're willing to make a lot of changes, and they're open. If the right kind of person, you have to have the right kind of mindset. You have to be open to it. But and this is true of myself too. Like the times that I have grown the most have been the times where I have failed most spectacularly.
Well, if what we're doing is working well enough, we're not going to invest the energy to change.
Yes, exactly. Right. It's hard. It's like that triggers the sort
unfortunate,
of fight or flight response.
Yeah.
I know. Right. Like, they say, profound personal change happens from either desperation or inspiration. Yep. I would say that the vast majority of time that most people can relate to is going to be the desperation, not the inspiration.
How do you explain growth mindset to your students? Have most people heard about it that you run into?
Yeah, I don't know that we necessarily call it out explicitly. Like we talk about it some. It's hard because.
Or do you just demonstrate it through your practice?
We have we're working with people who sometimes they'll have 2 weeks until their exam, 3 weeks until their exam. So we have to work with some constraints, and so they say that the constraints are sort of like the handmaiden of creativity. So we have a lot of constraints, and so we've had to get kind of creative of how, because in an ideal world, you'd be able to sit there and
envisioning you with a year-long
have and there are circumstances in which that's true. But I would say a lot of people come to us and they're like, they just failed. Their test is in 3 weeks or 2 weeks or something. And
what do you do with that? What can you do with that?
So it depends, right? Obviously, everyone is different. Sometimes, you have to be honest, right? I think that one of the most powerful things that I've learned is that in order to really help someone to transform, you have to have them trust you. And in order to build trust, you have to be honest. The best way is to just be upfront with them and say, look, we've seen some dramatic changes. We've had people who've improved their score by, they've gone from a 190 something to a 260 something in 2 months. We've seen it.
Astronomical.
But I wouldn't bet my medical career on it. Right. And so we'll have that conversation of okay, let's look at where you are right now, and let's look at where you want to be, and what would be what would I be willing to bet my medical career on, and what would I not be willing to bet my medical career on. And these are the options. Here, if you try and sell out and do everything possible in the next 2 weeks, maybe you can increase your score, but these are the risks. Right, the risks are you're going to cut corners. The risks are, that you're going to be at the same place in 2 weeks as you are now, right? Or you can take maybe the slower approach, the slower burn approach of really trying to transform your skills, really trying to, approach things differently, and, and just sort of accept that you're going to take a longer time, and just lay it out, right? And say these are the two options. This is, this isn't the law. This is just my own perspective on this, and this is, if you want to work with us, this is kind of how I see it. And so, you just obviously everyone, if you had all the time in the world, obviously there's things that you could do differently, but that's just not the world that we live in. There's deadlines for when your school forces you to take your test. There's deadlines for when you have to take your test if you want to get your score before you apply to residency, if you want to, all of these things. And so it's the nice thing about what we're able to do, at least in the one-on-one work that we do, is that we're able to tailor it to that particular situation.
Yeah, it sounds pretty helpful to people, because I imagine they could be feeling pretty desperate with 2 weeks to the deadline.
Yeah.
To be able to do anything would be great.
Yeah.
When you think about what's been hard for you, like we're thinking about other people's obstacles, I'm wondering what kind of obstacles you found for yourself going through this, creating this new road.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it's very, very, very different from medicine in many ways.
Yeah.
One of my MD PhD friends when I was at Stanford said that medicine and research are very similar in some ways and very different in some ways. They're very similar in the sense that you have a hypothesis, you will order some tests, you'll do some tests, experiments, whatever you want to call it, and you're looking to either refute or confirm your hypothesis. Fundamentally, that they're both the same, and this is essentially the same thing, right? Like when you're coaching someone, you have a hypothesis, you try to execute on that plan, and then you see did that work or not. In the case of having, say, like a business and research, right? The difference between research and medicine is that in medicine, most of the time when you have a hypothesis, you're right or pretty close, right? Like you push propofol and they're
going to fall asleep.
That's it, right? Whereas if you're in research, right, like your husband is in research, like so many times you have this idea of what you think is going to happen and it doesn't work. The first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, and you've got to figure out how am I going to
what
make
is
this work?
happening here? Yeah,
Exactly. And so I think that in business, that has been the challenge for me, is to kind of develop that mindset of like, okay, like there is a way. Like I refuse to believe that someone is just like not smart enough to like do this test. If someone has made it into medical school, there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to succeed in these exams. And to figure out exactly what it would take for someone who is failing. I mean, like we've had people who've literally failed their exam and in under 2 months gone from literally the bottom 3% to the top 3% in 2 months. The same person using virtually the exact same resources as they were using before, right? So it's not a who problem, right?
And it's not
a what problem,
Yeah.
because they're using the same what. They're using the same question bank, they're using the same books, they're using the same lectures. All we've changed is the how. How is it that they're using those resources?
Yeah.
And by changing that, you can dramatically change their outcomes.
What I'm hearing you're saying makes it sound very different from what the test preps were that I've done in my life. I don't think I got any teaching about the how. I think it was all in the materials. This sounds like a really different approach. Was it obvious to you that it was in the how, or was this a discovery?
That's a good question. I think that was more of a discovery. Like, I started with the belief that, again, if I could take someone who was failing, like, because I wasn't necessarily particularly good at the test taking part, but I did learn the skills, and so I did have this inclination to think like, okay, this is something that can be taught, and it isn't just like a material thing. Like one of the observations that I made was virtually everyone, because just of human nature, ends up using very similar, if not the exact same resources.
Yeah.
Most people end up using UWorld, the QBank. Yeah. Most people, so save step one, right? Most people use First Aid. Most people use, like you can name the most popular resources. However, the people that failed and the people that scored in the top 1% were using the exact same resources.
Yeah.
It can't be, right? Like, I think one of the challenges is that, we look at like we think, okay, and schools do this, right? Like, so like Stanford, you would take the people that did the best the year before, you'll put them on like a panel of speakers, and then they'll go in front and they'll say like, oh, this is what I did. And then everyone like frantically will try to copy what they did because they think, oh, okay, well that's what it takes to be successful. The problem is that there's a lot of what they call silent evidence, right? There's a lot of people who tried that same thing, maybe, and didn't succeed, but they're not on the panel and you don't hear from them. There's a famous example from the Nassim Taleb, right, in the book about the Black Swan, where he says, if you were to take, like, say, 100 rats from New York City, and you were to irradiate them, all of those rats, to the point where you're killing off in succession, like the weakest rats, so that you're left with only the strongest rats. if you were to compare that group of rats to the average rat population, they would be stronger. But only because you have, even like they've been weakened by the radiation, but because there's so much silent evidence, because you have so much drop off in your sample, they are like, it's going to look like that
like radiation is a great idea.
Is a great idea.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, here's the example of like gulags in Russia. Like, oh, the gulags, like, these like concentration camps, like made people stronger from them. Like, no, they just killed off the people that like couldn't survive. And so the only people that survived were the weakest ones. And so the issue with those sort of panels where they're inviting all these people is that like, we have no idea if doing that thing that they did, if that was the cause of why they were successful.
Yeah. And it seems kind of tricky also for me. It seems a little bit like although on the face it seems like we're trying to embrace a growth mindset, like let's learn from each other's techniques, it actually has a little bit of a performance mindset to it also.
It's
a little
true.
bit, that seems a little tricky to me. Do people have insight, do you find, into their own what they're doing that works versus what they're doing that doesn't work? Or is that what do you see?
There's sort of, I think, two parts to that question, which is one is that like, are people incentivized to say like everything that they did? And then the second is like, would they even know, even if they thought of it? My guess is, so I think that there is an incentive to try to hold back on saying some of the things that people did. Like, for example, I think in medicine, everyone has this idea that like, oh, I don't want to be a gunner. Like, I don't want to be known as a gunner. Or there's a lot of people that don't want to be known as a gunner, right? And so this was true at Stanford, where they called it like Stanford Duck syndrome, where it's like, you would kind of pretend like you didn't do a lot, but like you would actually be like studying really, really hard.
Oh, that was very true. That was very true in my school too. Yeah.
And so like, I think that's just true, like in general, right? Like, I think that there was a guy at
because it's got to be effortless to reinforce a performance mindset.
Exactly.
Of like, I was born this way.
Yeah, like this is just me. Like, I remember there was a guy in medical school who would always tell people, when they found out that he did well in step 1, he would say like, hey guys, it's just yield and first aid, that's it. Which is sort of like humble brag. Like, it's sort of like a, hey guys, like I'm doing the same things that everyone else is doing. And like,
it's kind of tricky, isn't it?
Like, you kind of reading between the lines, you're essentially then forced to conclude that
you're a superior being.
He's just
born better.
Oh yeah, he's just like this genius guy, which might be true, right? But it doesn't help you solve the problem of how do I do better. And so I think that in terms of the second part of the question, right? So yes to the like, is there a disincentive to actually share what people did? And in terms of the second question of like, how, like, do people actually have insight into what it takes to be successful? I think the answer is probably no, would be my guess. And the reason I say that is just because I went through a lot of iterations of the tutoring process that we do to get to our current process.
Yeah.
Because what I thought it was, like what it took for me to be successful was very, very different for what it's taken some people like that are failing to be successful. Like for me, it was like, I just had to do a lot of questions, or, I had to, like for me, it was like learning how to become a morning person because I needed to do more of what it is that I was doing, right? It was more of like a quantity at that point because I kind of I'd already developed a lot of the skills of how to learn things well. I had learned, so what I had to learn was like, okay, I need to learn how to like remember it. So like the Anki card process, that was something that I was like, okay. But to me, it was like, oh, they just need to use Anki. What I didn't realize is that there would be this long process of trying to that's not necessarily a long process, but that there would be this process of having to teach people how to make flashcards. Not that you should use it, but how to use it.
Yeah.
That was something I just did not anticipate. I knew kind of like, okay, like we should teach people how to read questions, but I didn't anticipate that a lot of people wouldn't know how to learn concepts in the first place.
Yep.
And so these were all things that like, I would try these ideas with people and some people would fly. It would be like, because that was the missing piece. Like my missing piece was the same as their missing piece. What I didn't realize was just that everyone's missing piece is different.
Yeah.
And what it takes, like the missing piece for someone that can't even get to the point of passing is very different from the missing piece for someone that's trying to go from like 240s to like 260s. Very, very different.
Figuring out the missing piece is such a big part though for all of us in all of life. It's such a neat perspective. And as you're like with your years of experience and your ever broadening data set, it must be fast. You must be getting just more. I mean, you're just a diagnostician of missing pieces for excellence in learning. It's a really neat.
That's a great way of saying
it's a
it.
neat way to, neat approach to be able to have.
I think it's just, you also just kind of recognize the patterns, right? Like
You get better and better. I mean, that's what so much of diagnostics are.
Yeah, diagnostics, medicine, very, very similar. You know, it's just like, it's like the exact, in many ways, like the exact same thing. You realize that like, okay, like this is the common thread.
Yeah.
Like when I see this, like most of the time it's going to be because of this. Not always, but like most of the time.
What else has stood out for you or surprised you in your last few years in your path to this?
I think I've been surprised. Like I've always believed that like people could be successful if you taught them the right thing.
Yeah.
I don't think I realized just how much that could be true. We've had people, like we had someone recently who she failed step 1 4 times.
Yeah.
Which is the maximum number you can fail. She had to petition a state medical board, like multiple state medical boards, to find one that would sponsor her to take it a 5th time. Remarkable mindset, right? So like to be able to still get back on the horse after so many literal failed attempts. But she was someone who obviously like wasn't naturally very good at these tests.
Yeah.
She learned how to approach the material, and we don't know her score yet, but she had scored like 272 on her practice test before she retook it. Mm-hmm. Like in my wildest dreams, I don't think I would have seen a case like that, where we've had multiple cases where people have failed and gone to like the 260s on step 1 and step 2.
Can I ask where she was getting stuck? What was her missing piece? Would you say?
I think that in her case, it was a problem of learning. I think it was probably, in most cases where people are failing, it's a problem of learning.
Of learning the material well enough and in depth, and really mastering the concepts.
Correct, yeah. Like, because a lot of people, like for example, I was working with someone who, I was like, okay, like you have to master it, right? Like that sounds simple, but there's actually a lot of pieces to that. And so I said like, okay, so tell me something that you've learned recently. And she said, oh, okay, well, I learned about tamponade. I was like, okay, great. So tell me about tamponade. Like, what is tamponade? She said, well, tamponade is, it's like, it can be up to like 250 cc's and you can get like JVD. And like, she was describing all of these associated sort of things that she had read about tamponade. But I said, no, wait, like, what is tamponade?
What's the mechanism?
Like, what actually is happening in tamponade? And she said, oh, I don't know. I was like,
what is the unifying process?
What is the unifying principle? Mm-hmm. Right, what is actually going on, right? It's not the number of cc's, it's the fact that you have fluid in the pericardium that's pushing in on the outside and preventing the heart from expanding, which is limiting the preload, which is limiting the stroke volume, which is like, right, like there's so many concepts tied into this.
Well, it makes all the other things, the volume, the JVD, makes everything else, the hypotension, it makes it all make sense.
Yes, exactly. And so that's, I think, that's the biggest, like for people that are failing, that is usually the thing that's holding them back. Like we have we call it the score framework, where we break down sort of, if you're failing, like it's probably this kind of problem. If you're trying to get to like an average, it's probably this kind of problem. And if you're trying to get to like a 260, like it's probably this kind of problem. That's what we sort of focus on.
How do you get people to think about, like for that student in particular, how do you get people to go from, like you can explain the concept and she can realize it, how do you help them to generalize that process of learning concepts?
So it's sort of in the same way that I think we've developed our system, right? If you can do it once, you can do it again. And so we focus a lot on trying to get someone to just be able to do it once. So we say, okay, like we typically start with coronary artery disease because it's a pretty clean concept, right? It's a blood flow, so it's like ischemia, it's pressure differentials, and maybe a little bit of inflammation. So it's some fundamental concepts in medicine, but you don't have to understand really much else about medicine to understand how coronary artery disease works.
Yes.
Right? You've got a blood vessel, it feeds the heart, and if it's blocked, the heart can't get blood, and the heart is eventually going to die, you're going to have inflammation. Like, you don't have to, it's not like hematology, it's not like immunology where it's like... You don't need
that many other pieces to be able to understand it.
Exactly. Like if I, immunology, like in order to know what a neutrophil does, I have to know what an antibody is. I have to know what a complement is. Like there's so many related things. So we try to just restrict it to something that they can learn. We're like, okay, like just don't worry about anything else. Just focus on learning this one thing.
The order you're making me realize is incredibly important in order to be able to have. So that's why, depending on where your knowledge base is, starting with just general questions might be a failing way to start, because you'd just be memorizing. To really get the concepts, it's got to be built in the right order.
Yeah,
very thoughtful.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because there are things that will. It's just like you want to build up that sense of competence.
Yeah.
Right. You want to show someone like, hey, when you do this, you can do it.
That's also where the joy is when it makes sense. That like, oh yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. And so, just like if you're trying to teach your kid how to walk, right? Like you're not gonna try to teach like a baby on like a steep hill with like a bunch of like jagged, right? Like you want to make the environment conducive to that particular level. And so for people, that are struggling, that are like, they failed or they're failing or they can't get their score to go up or they're really, really frustrated. You want to make that environment conducive to their learning. And so, and then you step it up and you say, okay, like now you've mastered this level. Now it's like a video game. And it's like, then you go to the next level. Like you don't start on level 99, right? You start on level 1 and then you beat that level and then you go to the next level and then, you might lose a bit and, you'll figure out where the problems are, but you'll get better, right? This is how video games are so addicting, right?
Yeah.
Is because it's graduated difficulty. Mm-hmm. And so
it's very carefully tiered towards just what is going to appeal to you but not discourage you. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's the right level of, they say flow is having a clear goal, immediate feedback, and it's just the right level of difficulty.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm playing tennis with someone that's just a little bit better than me, that's fun.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm playing tennis with someone that's like way, 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 way better than me, not fun.
And really not fun for them.
Really not fun for yeah, exactly. It's not fun for them. It's not fun for me. Yeah. And so that's what we're trying to do is that, in this environment is we're trying to just move up that difficulty so that there's always that next challenge, right? And so we're not trying, because we've tried a lot of different ways. It clearly does not work to have someone just like, just give them like this huge amount of stuff that they have to do in this really, really difficult subject.
You're giving them the 1 foot hurdles.
Yes, exactly.
You keep hurdling if it's only 1 foot.
Yeah, exactly.
You might not even realize it's a big hurdle. It's a hurdle.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there's so many generalizable concepts like the setting people up for success by altering the environment. And then their ability to succeed just grows and grows and grows. Yes. And you end up having to modify the environment less and less and less until it's just a free-for-all exam.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, we started with the idea of, begin with the end in mind, right? We started with, okay, what do we want people to have, right? We want people, right, in this particular context, we want people to have excellent knowledge and be able to apply it under any circumstance for, in an exam environment for any subject.
So I want to take that one level more.
Okay.
I want to be able to have that knowledge, retain it forever, and apply it in any context. I just want to these skills you're teaching are life skills, career and life skills.
Yeah, and in fairness, this is the thing. Like, we didn't set out to do this, right? But I sort of explicitly.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we hear from people is that when I go on rounds, I am confident. Like, it is different. I present differently than my friends. I understand, and am able to answer questions that I'm pimped on much differently. Yep. It is just different, right? Like, if you can explain your thought process.
They have a deep knowledge of their thinking. They're used to answering their Anki questions that are not just one-word answers, which many people are trained to answer, but with actually a whole process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably the best compliments that we've ever received were, and multiple people have said this, the worst day of my life was failing my exam. But the best day of my life was failing my exam, because it gave me the opportunity to transform my approach, and it has completely changed the trajectory. So we had a student who, she was a non-US IMG, applying into OB, which is a competitive specialty. So she didn't have a green card, had no connections, not a lot of research, and she had failed one of her exams. And when she came to me, her first score was a 202, which is 12 points below passing for step 2. And she was like, but again, desperation, right, gave her the opportunity, right, for massive personal transformation. She said, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get a 260. Like, I just, I need you to tell me what it is that I need to do, but I'm going to figure this out. In about 3 months, she went from a 202 to a 262. She ended up scoring, this is on her practice test, she ended up scoring 261. She was rejected from a lot of programs because she was a non-US IMG and she'd failed one of her tests. So she, and was applying to a competitive specialty. But she got admitted to her top choice program. Went on to be the top resident there, like literally scored the highest in her entire class, matched into REI, which is the most competitive specialty in all of OB in a prominent program on the East Coast. She is doing fantastically. And she says it completely changed my trajectory. Yeah. She had, she'd taken step 1, she'd scored, kind of below average. She was like, it was fine. Like it was good enough. She said failing was really the wake up call that I needed to really transform my approach. And it made all the difference.
I believe it, because if she hadn't failed, she never would have needed to take this deep dive into what is new, what is learned. Like you're talking about deep learning in a very thorough level, being able to apply it across different areas.
Yeah.
I bet she's a great resident. It must be fun for you to see these successes. I bet it's really uplifting work.
Yeah, it is fun. I mean, I think that is probably the most fulfilling thing, because I think that my mom was a teacher. She was a college professor, and she would always use the analogy of a drop in a still pond.
Yeah.
There's all of these ripples from just one interaction or one sort of impact that you can have on one person. I think in education and medicine in particular, that is particularly true, because you're impacting people that are going to impact other people.
So many lives, yeah.
And so it's something that, it's like, I have to remind myself, it can feel kind of, I don't want to say overwhelming, but like it's a big responsibility, because you do have a large impact on a lot of people, so it's like we worked with a lot of people who it's like, this is it. Like I had one of the nicest gifts I ever got from a student was a student who, he literally was like 3 months away from getting kicked out of medical school. His school had said, he'd already taken a lot of time, he had to take a year off because he wasn't ready to take step 1. And his school had told him, like, this is it. Like, you've taken now, 9, I can't remember, it's like 8 or 9 months of your time. And you need to take this test or that's it. Like, you can't be a student here. And he didn't know what to do, didn't know how to study. And just, he completely transformed his approach. Did much better. He passed step 1. And then did substantially better on step 2. He's now an anesthesia resident. It is so cool to be able to, because like he is someone that there's a very good chance that we would not have him as a physician if he had not been able to overcome this hurdle. And so it's something that, that was a great moment.
What about for those of us who are a little bit too late and have already made it through our step exams and shelf exams? But what about even for like my residents taking their exams? Do you have any advice?
So it's a different kind of challenge for people that are in clinical practice. I was actually invited to give a Grand Rounds talk at Michigan State last summer. And the title of the talk was, how do you study when you have no time?
Yeah,
and
it
basically,
is a different problem.
Yeah. And so I think that one of the most important things that you can take with you in clinical practice is, if you just can learn one thing new per day and never forget it, there is, because you have a lot of days, but not a lot of hours per day, you can still reap the same benefits. In 1,000 days, like let's just say that you just, like it's overwhelming to think like, oh my gosh, like I have to study like, for 2 hours or something. But like, just think like, okay, what's the one thing today that would make the biggest difference of all the things that I could possibly need to know? Like, what's the one thing? I'm just gonna learn that one thing. I'm gonna make one good flashcard, and I just commit to do all of my flashcards that are due every day. You would think that if you'd made 1,000 flashcards over 1,000 days, that you'd have a lot of studying that you had to do. But in reality, if you do the math, it ends up being it's like less than 20.
Okay.
And so you might have to do 18 flashcards after 1,000 days. And that's it. But in doing those 18 flashcards, which maybe takes 10 minutes,
Okay.
you can remember all 1,000 things that you made and put into your flashcards. And so in clinical practice, right, like you've got to take your board exams like every 10 years, and right, but you have a lot of days. And so, just one thing can make a dramatic difference, just a little bit, if you can make sure that you never forget it, right? So that's sort of that mechanism. If you can learn things and never forget it, there is an incredible number of things that you can do with that. Because especially in clinical practice, like most people's scope of practice is much more limited than the wide breadth of things that you need to know for really general exams like step 1 or step 2 or step 3.
Very different.
Right? It's much more depth
Yeah.
and much less in terms of the breadth.
Yeah.
In most cases, not all cases. But if you just, like, most of what you do, right, the Pareto principle, like 80% of what you do might fall like within 20% of the particular like use cases.
Yep.
If you just focus all of your energy on, like if you, over the next, say, 365 days, you're just like, okay, I'm gonna learn one new thing every single day. And I'm just gonna slowly chip away at like the most common use cases, the things that, if I knew would be really, really useful. By the end of 365 days, like, I don't know, maybe you'd have like 10 flashcards you'd have to do. Like it's really not that much, but you would know 365 of your weakest things would now be things that you knew. And you would only have to do like literally minutes per day of studying in order to maintain it.
I'm going to give this a try. And what I'm thinking about is also because a lot of the things that I'm learning now are kind of, they might like, it's not necessarily just a fact written down, or it's not a process that's clearly delineated anywhere, but more best ways to interact in certain interactions with different types of patients and team members and sort of more complex things. It'll be interesting to experiment with how to make these cards and think through it. But I bet keeping it somewhere closer to the forefront of my brain will help me to pull it when I need it. What's one thing you're working on for you?
One thing that I think that I've always struggled with and that has held me back in many ways is insecurities and feeling like I wasn't good enough. And I think I've had sort of like, I don't even want to call it like a stealth fixed mindset. I think I just had a fixed mindset. I think I just thought like, okay, I'm not good enough. And so if something went well, then I would think, oh, well, that's just because it was, like, I would sort of explain away like why it was easy or something like that. It didn't prove that I wasn't, that I wasn't good enough. Or it wouldn't go the way that I wanted. And I would say, oh, well, that's just kind of proof that I'm not good enough. I think that the thing that I'm working on the most right now is to look at setbacks as just natural. It's like, of course this is, it's just like, if I was a researcher, right, like I would have to develop this mindset of like, of course my experiment didn't work. Like, like,
why should it?
Yeah,
like we don't even know how this, we don't even know what this is about. Yeah, this is research.
Exactly. Like maybe my hypothesis is wrong, maybe my setup is wrong, maybe this particular thing is wrong. I mean, like there's so many things that can go wrong. And so I think that's what I'm working on the most. It's just like, it's like, it is expected. It is not a sign of something deficient in me. Like all of these challenges, all of these things that we think of as bad things, right? Like the people that fail their test.
Yeah.
Once you get past the emotional response, once you get past the fear and the pain, which are real, those are very, very real natural reactions. It also, you can see that even in the absolute darkest day of your life, there is still opportunity.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, probably ultimately that's like the biggest thing that I'm working on. It's not just to think like, oh, okay, this is natural, but actually to see the setbacks as, oh, this is great. This is fantastic. Like there is something behind this, that there is an opportunity, lurking behind this.
I think that's true, but I think that's very hard. I think I think that takes time.
Of course. Yeah. It's like a muscle. Yeah.
Yes. And there's an alternative. I'm curious what you think of this alternative way to think about it, which is not, oh, this was great, or oh, this was bad, but just like, oh, this is, feel the emotional response, let it be, let it move on, let those thoughts move on. And then, like, whether it be a good thing or a bad thing, that it not rock the boat too much, it's going to be work.
So I agree. I mean, like, if you ended it at just the like, oh, like, hey, this is like a good thing, and like, I'm just going to throw up my hands to fate, and like, you know, I agree. Like, I think that is
a dangerous approach.
Very, very dangerous, right? Because it becomes a form of denial.
Yeah.
I think that what I'm trying to cultivate is instead to see it, to try to recognize the opportunity and develop the execution skills and the mindset to actually follow through on the opportunity.
Takes great clarity of thought.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. It's so interesting getting to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, this was great.
It's really fun.
Love to have the opportunity to talk. And
it's really neat to get to hear your insights after like this huge voyage you've taken on this. Thank you.
Yeah.